Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to Darbi and my plenary about making Guillain-Barré livable instead of survivable, and just how Darbi progressed through 8 wards with her whole journey. We just want to show you a short video, and it'll just definitely take you through some of the perspectives that Darbi had to counter as she went through her journey. Hope you enjoy it, and here we go.
Darbi Aitchison had everything going for her. Young and healthy, the University of Victoria student was an avid athlete who loved being outdoors.
1, 2, 3.
But she's been bedridden in hospital after being paralyzed by a devastating illness in March of 2015.
Couldn't walk, and the left side of my face had started to droop, and I couldn't close my eyes.
Ready?
Yeah.
It started with a bad headache and backache after a soccer game. Then Darbi's fingers started tingling, and within a week she was completely paralyzed, only able to blink her eyes.
It was terrifying.
The diagnosis was Guillain-Barré Syndrome.
The nerves are attacked by the immune system after a stomach or a respiratory illness. And we don't know the reason that it happens, but it can cause paralysis throughout the body. Let's roll. Other way.
The paralysis was so bad, Darbi couldn't talk and needed a ventilator to breathe.
Up and away.
And for the last 3 months, the 22-year-old's been undergoing intensive and very painful physiotherapy.
Being a nurse, I knew where it was going, so it was really hard. Of course, family was all asking, how's she doing and what has she got? And I would say, she's got Guillain-Barré, but don't Google it because it's ugly. Because it's just long haul.
Who's going to win today, Germany or US?
Germany.
A big soccer fan, Darbi had tickets to a FIFA World Cup game in Vancouver.
Don't want to sell the tickets?
Hell no.
And now that she can sit up, the nurses at Victoria General's ICU wanted to help make her dream come true.
Considering everything that she's been through, she's just had the most positive attitude and been such a fighter, so we just knew we had to help this dream come true for her.
The nurses started a GoFundMe page raising more than $4,000.
I'm flabbergasted, like their dedication and love that they've put into it is out of this world.
And when we told Air Canada Darbi's story, the airline offered to cover the flights, so all the fundraising money can go towards the months of recovery Darbi still has ahead of her.
Sorry.
And when I asked her what this ordeal had taught her,
Not to take anything for granted. Just to be able to take every day and embrace it.
and that's exactly what Darbi did at the World Cup in Vancouver last July, taking in all the action from her wheelchair with her nurses and mum by her side, making her dream come true despite the odds.
It's been a struggle. I mean, there were definitely days when it was just kind of thought maybe today is a good day to give up.
And Darbi beat the odds again in October. Just months after she couldn't walk or talk, this avid athlete is going home, all because she refused to give up.
My thoughts are the harder you work, the better results you're going to get, and just worked as hard as I could.
But saying goodbye wasn't easy.
She's touched all of our lives. What an ordeal for a 22-year-old girl to go through, and she has shown immense courage and spirit throughout all of this, which has inspired us all.
After 7 months in hospital, Darbi's finally going home, and she insisted on walking out of the hospital on her own.
The number of times that I've moved from hospital to hospital, I've always been in a stretcher or in a wheelchair, so being able to take that next step and move myself out of here, I think is just kind of that, the motivation to keep going from here on out.
And just 6 months after leaving hospital, Darbi did something unthinkable. She entered the TC 10K.
I've talked to doctors that dealt with me way back at the beginning, and no one ever expected me to walk them on my own again.
With only walking poles as support, Darbi crossed the finish line triumphant.
Really excited that I actually did complete it. Didn't just say I was, never actually go through with it, so really ecstatic.
It's hard to realize the distance we've come from a year ago, where we were, and we'll just keep on going.
First, I want to introduce you to Darbi and myself. Darbi, she is a UVic Bachelor of Kinesiology student with aspirations to go into physiotherapy. She's a sailor, flag football player, soccer player, and as many people can account from Island Health, she is a woman of absolute overwhelming determination. As for myself, I'm like the person with many heads. In the public realm, I work for Island Health in their acute medicine and respiratory wards. I also am with the adult cystic fibrosis outpatient clinic. In the private realm, I co-own Fernwood Health and Performance and work as a physiotherapist there. And then I also work with a couple associations, both with the Physio Association as the public practice chair and with CPA as the chair of all the volunteers that have been great working with us this weekend. So I hope you're enjoying the Congress so far, and let's continue on. So first, a little bit about Guillain-Barré Syndrome. Not many people know about it because of its rarity. It actually only occurs in about 1 in 100,000 people. It's a syndrome that is affecting the body's immune system by attacking the peripheral nerve systems. It attacks the myelin and axons, and it's actually also known as acute inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. The thing about this syndrome is it is absolutely non-contagious autoimmune disorder of unknown cause. There's been many things that have been attributed to leading up to the progression of Guillain-Barré, whether it's surgery, a respiratory illness, or a stomach illness. Even at times they've even indicated as inoculations or vaccines as causing it. But again, there's no true knowledge as to how it starts. Often, the stage of the greatest weakness is reached within 2 weeks of the start of symptoms. And at this point, there's no known true cure, but treatments are going to focus on decreasing the severity of illness while increasing quality of life and accelerating recovery. There's so many treatment complications to health, so that's also where we focus a lot of our work with our patients on. So next up, Darbi's going to talk with you guys, but I just want to let you know a little bit about her journey, at least the grand scheme of her journey. She was with us for a good 230 days through all the different hospitals. And by all the different hospitals, I mean 4. She went through Cowichan District Hospital, Victoria General Hospital, Vancouver General Hospital, and Royal Jubilee Hospital. And in that, she ended up being in 8 different wards. So as you can see, that would be interactions with so many people in the interprofessional care team, including the physiotherapists, of which she saw 9 different physiotherapists, including 2 of our UBC student physiotherapists. So I'd like to pass it off to Darbi, and she's going to talk to you more about her very long journey that she went through.
Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. Welcome, guys, to your weekend of education. My name is Darbi, and just going to go through and try and give you a basic understanding of kind of what my journey was like. Everybody's journey is different, but for me, this was my last 15 months. So, like Scott was saying, a lot of Guillain-Barré patients see their symptoms differently and are presented differently, and it can be caused by a number of different things. For me, it began March 8th, which was a Sunday. I was at a soccer game, like every other soccer Sunday that we had, and my toes started tingling, which would have been fine. Didn't really think much of it. I got laughed at saying my cleats were too tight, and that's what we contributed to. Went home, studied, wrote my exams the next day, woke up that morning with a back pain and a bit of a headache. Didn't really think much of it. Kind of put it towards, maybe I ate too much ice cream or chocolate almonds when I was studying, but kind of brushed it off and said, took a couple Tylenol, ibuprofen, it'll be gone in no time. But the next morning, woke up and it still wasn't gone, had gotten worse. Wasn't really sure what my next steps were, so I called my mom, who's RN up in Cowichan, and first thing she said was, don't mess with the nervous system. That's not something you really want to fiddle with, so up I went. We went into the ER, spent a couple hours there, not really knowing what was going on, didn't get any answers, took some blood tests, took blood pressure, the normal things. Threw up for the first time in 15 years, which was foul, absolutely foul. I hate throwing up. But that was kind of another little trigger that something might be a little worse than we had originally anticipated. So went home, still had IVs in my arm. Mom kept fluids going and kind of crossed our fingers that things would get better. Woke up the next morning, things hadn't really improved, but they hadn't gotten significantly worse. for the headache and back pain aspect of things. However, my balance had decreased. I was using walls to walk. I was using countertops to bend down and grab bowls and plates and that kind of thing. So kept an eye on it for the rest of the day, slept on it through the night. Next morning went back into the ER because nothing had gotten any better. Things have continually gotten worse. Little tip if you want to get into the ER really quick, faint at the triage desk. Then they just stick you on a stretcher and pop you right in. That was great, but they still didn't have any answers. They did lumbar punctures, CAT scan, x-ray, number of different procedures, and nobody really had any additional information. So I went back home, had a bath, thought that maybe that might calm the nerves, calm the muscles, and make some sort of an improvement. But thank goodness I didn't lock the door because I was not able to get out on my own. I couldn't sit up by myself. I had to call my mom in to get me out of the tub to bed because I was at the point where I could walk but couldn't hold my own weight. So I was using the walls quite a bit more. I was using railings and countertops even more than I had originally. So Friday, still at home, still no improvements. Things were getting worse. Still on the IV fluids with my mom. Friday afternoon, my left side of my face had started to droop. Not significantly, but enough that I could feel a difference. It wasn't necessarily visible right at the beginning, but the smile wasn't the same. I couldn't puff my cheek out quite the same. My blinks, and I couldn't wink in that eye. So we called the hospital just to see whether this was a common symptom for something else that we hadn't checked or what was going on. They said if it doesn't clear up by the next day, come on back in. So that's what we ended up doing. It had gotten significantly worse by the next day, and I wasn't even able to get off the couch. So we had to call an ambulance, got myself to the hospital, did more lumbar punctures, more blood work, more CAT scans, x-rays, everything. And their best guess was viral meningitis, which I had no idea what it was at that point. Mom didn't seem overly concerned whether that was just a play that I wasn't recognizing. But I was super bummed because the Saturday was the day I was supposed to go watch the Canucks annihilate the Toronto Maple Leafs, and my brother got the free ticket. So I was watching from the pediatric ward at Cowichan District Hospital as my brother and one of my best friends watched the hockey game that I was supposed to be at. Luckily, Canucks won, so that was okay. But they still had no answers on what was going on, and I was told that if nothing cleared up by the following week, I would be seen by a neurologist in an outpatient clinic. Sunday came around. This was exactly 1 week since I first started feeling symptoms, and we had gotten a call from the neurologist down at the Victoria General Hospital saying that I was to come down as soon as possible. He wanted to do tests. He wanted to see me. So down I went, masked up for viral meningitis. He took one look at me, read my chart, and he said he'd do an EMG, but knew that GBS was what was going on. And my mom knew what that was because she'd been in the hospital scene for 20, 25 years. I didn't have a clue, and nobody seemed to realize that I didn't have a clue. So they were babbling back and forth in all their lingo, and I was sitting there nodding my head like the good patient. And finally it came to the point where I was like, guys, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they explained to me that it's an autoimmune disorder. This is what's going to happen. You're probably going to feel paralysis of some extent. We're hoping that we've caught it early enough that we can prevent it from going on any further. So I was administered the first dose of IVIG that night. I got a total of 3, but the rest of them were done in the ICU because the next day my breathing went significantly downhill. My swallowing mechanism was almost non-existent, so I was suctioning quite a bit. Met the RTs for the first time, and the following morning I was changed down to Victoria General ICU, and that's kind of where I stayed for the next few weeks. However, that first day I was in ICU, they started physio on me, which was probably the biggest sign that they did have some sort of hope, because why would they try physio on somebody who was going to see no progress, or who this was the end of the road for them? So right from the beginning, they got me out of bed, they moved. I couldn't do anything on my own, but they were moving me, they were sitting me in wheelchairs, leaning me back and forwards, and it was a good change of pace from lying in bed for those few days. So March 17th, transferred to Victoria General ICU. that day when I started the physio, I got the NG tube placed in. And that night, I ended up getting intubated because I couldn't breathe around the NG tube. Sedated me for the night, and that was kind of the last point where I was able to thoroughly communicate. But things had gone downhill so quickly, and I didn't realize completely what was going on. So I didn't have a chance to ask my extent of questions. It was kind of, I was at the mercy now of other people's curiosity and other people's interest to hear what I wanted to hear from the doctors. I was able to communicate via a clipboard and writing, but that lasted about 4 or 5 days, and then it was illegible and nobody could understand what I was talking about anymore. So during that next week, I received a PICC line, which caused a number of different heart rate issues with movement. And they were debating for quite a while on a trach, and it was held off for as long as possible, I think particularly because my mom she was scared at what it could then affect me long term because of the possibility of voice changes or permanent scars and those kind of things. So I think they held that off particularly for her. But in the long run, the trach had ended up being the better idea or the better option because it gave me freedom of being able to see around the intubation tube. So like I said, that following week got the PICC line, maintained physio with moving just of joints and keeping range of motion going. IVs, fluids, that kind of maintenance. They got going with ultrasounds on my legs to prevent blood clots. When I finally got transferred out of bed by the overhead lift, it was about a week and a half or 2 weeks after I first got symptoms, and that was a huge freedom because they had provided a wheelchair that I was actually comfortable in, that I was able to stay in for an extended period of time, about 45 minutes, which was long for me, but it also gave me the option of being able to move around a little bit within the room. And that also gave way to the schedule that they created for me. So I knew that, at 10 o'clock, physio was coming in. At 11:30, I was going into the chair. I would see this nurse and this doctor at this time. And it gave me things to look forward to each day so that I wasn't just mindlessly staring at the television, which somebody decided that HGTV was my channel, which I don't have any complaints. HGTV is fine. But every single day for 7 months, I'm pretty sure, we watched HGTV. And I was okay with it. I have no idea how my visitors survived because they were watching Leave It to Brian every single day. And I had lots of friends actually come make the drive over the Malahat to come see me. Friends from Vancouver came. So it was a good variation that kept my day changing so that I didn't get into that monotonous, dry, miserable rotation. Once they put the trach in, there was a lot of fiddling with the ventilator because I was an athlete at the time. I was a student. I didn't drink. I didn't smoke. I had healthy lungs. Trying to determine how much oxygen they could actually do in a breath volume was an extremely tedious process. So there were a lot of signals to try and get them to come back. And I felt like I couldn't breathe, but I couldn't say that I felt like I couldn't breathe. I would just look panicked, and my mom would call them in and, something's not right. Can we just change something? And eventually we got it figured out, but it ended up taking a few days just to figure out that what worked for me. Which these RTs, I can't imagine doing that for every single one, every single person, finding out that sweet spot for each individual. Which then led into, with all the tediousness of everything else, they found out the IVIG that I had been administered right at the beginning had destroyed my red blood cells, which is not the end of the world, but it prolonged a lot of other procedures because I couldn't do the plasmapheresis until my blood was back up to normal concentrations and normal ratios. So I had to wait about 2 weeks to try and then get my blood back to normal so we could move on to a next procedure. And I was continuously going downhill. Like Scott had said, 2 weeks is generally the low point for a lot of GBS patients. However, for me, it ended up being about week 4 when I was down in Vancouver and was at the point where I could only blink my eyes, and relied on my mom's intuition to pretty much know when something was wrong. Dr. Steibel, who was my original neurologist, noted the decreases, and I ended up having to wear an eye patch, which was a kind of a good icebreaker because a lot of my friends had never been brought into the medical system, so they were a little bit uneasy. But with the eye patch, one of them drew an eye on my eye patch, and it kind of was a little invitation that this is how it's going to be for the next little while, and we're just going to have to make the best of it. March 26th was a huge day for me. This was the first time I was allowed outside of the hospital, not just outside of my room, outside of the ward, but actually physically outside in the sun. It took a huge effort. We needed a physiotherapist, a respiratory therapist, a nurse, and my mom just to make the ordeal happen because of the wheelchair and the trach and my pump, and somebody had to open the doors. But it was that fresh air that I got for about half hour to 45 minutes every day that really changed my attitude about being there. And you can't open the windows in the ICU for good reason. But that fresh air and that sunshine was just that little bit of a natural, real life that kept me going once we then came back inside. And there was one day that I specifically remember, it was right at the beginning when we were just going outside, and the Victoria General Hospital helipad has a really rough surface. It has a couple picnic tables and benches, and we were way in the far corner because we were watching a helicopter take off, and all of a sudden it starts to hail, like really hail. So they have books over my head, and they're trying to push the wheelchair and pull the pumps and not tip anything over and not get everything wet as we're going back to the door. But of course, it's about 100 meters of very cobblestone-like ground. And by the time we got to the door, everyone was soaked. Everyone was just laughing. And I'm pretty sure I had the grin the size of like an 8-year-old does when they get a lollipop on my face because I love the rain. And that was the first real weather thing I had seen in weeks. So we checked the weather from now on, but that was a huge highlight to my ICU stay. But it was also countered with the first realization of how long and how negative things had gotten. I didn't know the extent that this would be a year, maybe 2, maybe 3 for recovery. I was thinking, April 10th, that's my birthday. I'm gonna walk by my birthday. And nurses came in and they wouldn't look necessarily miserable, but they just look sad or not quite as happy as I was used to seeing them. And my mom would come in with a little bit of she'd talk to the doctors and come in and not be who she was when she left the room that 15 minutes earlier. But I maintained my goal. I wanted to walk by April 10th, and that's what I was going to do. So when my blood finally became a normal ratio again, my red blood cells had regenerated, I was back to what they would consider relatively normal. I was flown over to Vancouver General Hospital to receive plasmapheresis, which is basically a dialysis machine for regenerating the albumin and plasma in your blood. And of the whole experience, the whole 230 days, this was one of the most difficult portions because it felt like everyone cared, everyone knew how to do their job, but you were just another person to them. You were just another patient. I wasn't Darbi, as the nurses at VGH knew me as, and would come in, knew my friends, knew my visitors. I was just another patient that needed treatment, and that's what they were going to do. But Vancouver is also a teaching hospital, which is fantastic. I'm a huge promoter of teaching, but there comes a point where you have to limit the teaching for the benefit of the patient. And they were doing treatments to me that were not necessary, that my mom could get no answer on why they were doing it, except for the fact that they were doing it to learn. There was a Navitube that they put in so that they could monitor my contractions so that they could match the ventilator with it. But at this point, I could do nothing. I could only cry, and that's what I was doing, but nobody noticed that that's what was happening. No one looked at my face, at my emotions, at who I was. They were looking at their little screen, telling them where they needed to put it, and then they were adjusting it up and down through my nose, which is really, really uncomfortable. And there came a point where my mom said, this is it. You put her under and you do it, or we're not having this. I'm like, ma'am, I think you're gonna have to step outside. And the look on her face, she could have mauled them. Like she was ready to take it outside. And she's like, I'm gonna stay. If she's here, I'm staying here. And you're just gonna have to work around me. I'm not in the way, but I'm standing up for her because you are not letting her needs fit your purposes. So I made it through the week at Vancouver General, made it past my birthday, didn't walk, but that was also the day when things started turning around. I could stick out my tongue again, which was a huge accomplishment, and I was transferred back to Victoria by April 12th and started physio again because physio had lapsed when we were in Vancouver. I didn't receive any additional treatment other than just the procedures that they had planned. So we got back on the physio plan, I got back going outside, and my emotional and mental well-being was taken more into consideration. Nobody ever told me how long of a stint this was going to be, but I think that might have been for the better because I was always seeing, I'm gonna walk by May, I'm gonna walk by Canada Day, I'm gonna walk by this, and I never said, you know what, maybe I'll walk by Christmas. It was always, I was looking towards that next goal as something that could easily be achieved. However, the pain in my feet got the better of me, and off I was sent to Jubilee to visit the ICU there with their Dr. Schwarkdahl, who was the pain specialist, and just to see if they could get a handle on the pain in my feet, which is a nerve pain, so you can't just stick ice on it and it'll be okay. It was a whole different type of pain that I had never experienced before, and that was getting the better of me. I couldn't handle it at this point. But we continued with physio, we continued with going outside, and it got to the point actually where there was another woman in ICU and we were doing outside trips together. So the two of us this was the time, and we would go out together and we'd sit in the garden, and our families would it gave some community to what was a very difficult time for both of our families. But it gave a little bit of something for her to look forward to and for myself to look forward to. And this is also when I was introduced to Scott, because he brought the mechanical cough assist machine into me, because I was one of the only patients in the hospital at that time who required it. So it was a great learning activity for his students, which was also a benefit because I was then involved with what I was interested. This was what I was studying to do. This is what I was really wanting to get involved with. So the students would come in, they'd ask how I was doing. I mean, I couldn't answer, but I could nod and I could shake my head a little bit at this point. So they'd ask me yes and no questions and ask, is it okay if I try this? And did that hurt? Or should I do it better this way? Or this muscle always gets me confused. And we'd kind of interact in a non-verbal on my side of things. But it gave me another aspect of my day that wasn't just watching HGTV. Now back in April, the friend I was supposed to go to the hockey game with ended up getting tickets to the women's FIFA final game in July when it was in Vancouver in 2015. And at that point, I was still under the impression, give it a couple weeks, I'll be out of here, no big deal. I might need a cane for the trip, but I got this, no big deal. Patty, who was the nursing leader at ICU in RJH, had made arrangements with the ICU at VGH and with Scott and a couple of the doctors that they were going to get me to the game because they knew I wasn't going to be out, but they didn't want to tell me that I wasn't going to be out, but they really wanted me to get there. So they got a huge campaign almost going. They got fundraising, they got bringing in community involvement, they brought out businesses, and they actually made it work. They actually organized it so that I was able to, in my wheelchair, make it over to the game. Pretty sure I cried when she told me because I had no idea that this was in the works. And I remember my mom telling me afterwards, she said that she was so scared when they told me because if they couldn't pull it off, that was going to be the devastation of the year for me. That was what I was looking forward to. From that point on, that was my goal. I was making it to the FIFA finals. I was going to watch whoever made it, hopefully Canada, it didn't end up being Canada, but I was going to watch the game. So about the same time that I was told FIFA was going to be a go, I also started weaning off of the vent, which was a huge process because that was also a step to outside of the ICU. However, the first day that they took me off the vent and actually stuck a passe-mur valve on me to see if I could speak was the one day that my mom had taken a break. They'd gone fishing, she'd organized so that people were still there with me. I wasn't on my own, but it was the one day that she was gone. She had no cell service. They were out off the West Coast. So I phoned and left a message with her, talking, babbling, saying pretty much anything I could figure out how to say. And then I found the house phone, and I phoned a couple of my friends. And I got a phone call back later on the one lady's phone I had used to call my mom, asking if everything was okay, because all of a sudden she had this caller ID that, the hospital had phoned, and she had no idea whose voice she was hearing. And I guess when she finally figured out what all was going on, she pretty much just drove straight down, because it was by the next morning that she'd figured out, and she was so upset. I mean, she was ecstatic, but she was so upset at the same time, because Scott at that point had run from 8 North, I believe, which is way up there, all the way over to ICU in the other building, to see me speak, because I had been mute for so long. Nobody had heard my voice in this new hospital. And I was finally able to, I didn't sound like myself. I was able to communicate, but I was hoarse and dry and a little bit blotchy, but it worked. And that was kind of the start to being able to slowly wean off the vent to get the trach out. So I was able to leave the ICU and progress along into the other wards of the hospital. The first full day I actually went off of the vent completely. I'm not exactly sure was planned that way, because I had spent the whole day off, and the last couple days I had done that and then gone back on for the night, come back off in the morning to try and train my lungs that this is how things were going to be. So I asked the RT, would you please put me on for the night, and I'll get them to take me off again in the morning. Yeah, no problem, absolutely. Go to sleep, wake up the next morning, call the nurse and ask her to take the vent off. She's like, what are you talking about? You're not on the vent. So somehow, I don't know whether that was his plan, he was going to trick me so that I could get off the vent permanently, or he actually forgot and I just was able to continue the whole night, or what happened. But that was my first time completely off the vent, 24 hours, and that was the last time I had actually been on the vent. So from there on out, I was independent in myself, and that got me out of ICU up to the respiratory ward, which is Scott's full-time position. So day 90, I left the ICU and got the penthouse suite of the hospital, which basically looks right down Bay Street and is better than any view I'm ever going to be able to afford. And the windows opened a little bit, which was perfect. During that first week out, I was now they were able to patch things up so they didn't have all these cords. So I actually got to take a shower, which lasted for about 13 minutes, and then I threw up all over myself. So it was a start. It was a start. We got down to figuring out how I can get in and out of wheelchairs, in and out of vehicles, what were the best way of doing it. And on day 99, we transferred me from a wheelchair that a friend had actually built that lifts up and down electronically, so I could get equal to the vehicle, slide from the wheelchair into the vehicle, and we went down to the beach for a little drive around to teach me how to ride in a vehicle, but also to teach my mom how to drive with me in the vehicle without being afraid and going super, super slow or cautious and getting ourselves into an accident in another way. So that was day 99. Day 100, my trach was permanently removed, and that set up for, there's a football festival in Duncan the last week of June, and I really wanted to go to it. That was the team I'd played for a couple of years. Those were some of my friends, so I was going to go down. They had done a ton of fundraising for me, had done a ton of encouragement, support for my family, for my friends, and so we planned that to get in and out of the vehicle. We planned that with the trach removal. Unfortunately, we got about 4 blocks away from the hospital and my catheter plugged, so that sent everything spiraling backwards and I never actually made it. But that was the start to being able to leave the hospital and gave a dry run for when we were then to go to FIFA in the coming weeks. So as FIFA approached, we were tasked with getting me able to sit up in the wheelchair for as long as possible, getting me so that I was able to keep my hands and my knees together as long as possible so that my feet weren't falling off the platforms, my arms weren't falling off the hand rests. So we started this lovely little exercise known as the tilt table, which I later deemed the torture table. And those were some of the hardest exercises we went through, but it also got me into that vertical position so that I could then be sat forward in the wheelchair to take different pressure points off of my bum and my legs, and then I could be leaned back again, and it was different variations that kept me able to stay in that position for so long. So we made it to FIFA. It was fantastic, and it was actually flawless. We didn't have any trouble. There was an accident on the way home, but it wasn't with us. We stopped, offered our help, and then kept on going home. The US won, which was fine by me. I was there, so that was all that I really cared about. And it was a good break mentally to be outside with my friends in a position that wasn't in the hospital. I mean, I had been outside in the hospital, but this was a whole new experience, something that they had wanted that we actually were able to put together. There were a couple nurses from the ICU at Victoria General that came along, and a couple of physiotherapists we saw while we were there. And it was just a huge success all around and made a huge difference to my emotional recovery. So the time came that I was to leave 8 North, so the respiratory ward. I had been off the vent long enough and was strong enough on my own, and I was sent down to the rehab ward at Jubilee. Met another physio and another awesome assistant. These were kind of the first steps at my independence. So they taped a spoon to my glove, so I was able to finally learn the motions of eating again. I got a haircut for the first time in 5 months. And I actually met another patient who had GBS at the same time. She was sick 3 weeks after I did. She was 13. Her mom was pregnant at the time and didn't know anything about the medical system. So it was kind of a tie that our families, we went through the whole thing sort of together. However, it was also a discouraging aspect for me because she was 3 months along. I was 4.5 months along, and she could walk by now. She was using crutches. She had ankle-foot orthotics, but she was independent. She was getting into this idea of going back to school, and I couldn't even move my knees yet. I could barely sit up on my own. I was still in the tilt and space wheelchair, still doing daily physio because I couldn't do anything on my own. And that was a bit of a reality check that this isn't going to be my version of how I saw this. This isn't going to be me better in a couple weeks. This is the long haul. This is what it's going to be. But that other young girl is still getting better, and we're still in the process of healing together. When they suggested that I was to go to the neuro rehab ward at Victoria General Hospital instead of just the rehab ward at the Jubilee, I was at the point where I just wanted to get better. I had just seen another girl who was far more farther along than I was by a long shot, and I was sick of moving, sick of the transitions, and they had offered me a shared room at the neuro rehab ward, and I wasn't having any of it. This wasn't what was going to happen. I wasn't into it. I wasn't moving. That was it. But the physiatrist came and actually saw me, explained why it would be more beneficial for me to be there, explained how the unit ran, and I ended up going over. I don't know whether it would have ended up being my idea in the long shot or whether they were just trying to give me the idea that I was in control. Either way, I ended up over there, and it ended up being a good thing because the last week I was at 5 North, or 6 North actually, in Jubilee, one of the physiatrists came in and told me, sat my mom and I down and said, this is probably the end of the road for you. I think you should look into putting an elevator in your house and a ramp up your front steps, and your mom should look into a care aide full time so she can take care of you. And kept going, and I don't know if that was his way of motivating me or whether that was actually his opinion. But at that point, if he was going to be that negative about my recovery, I was gone. This other doctor seemed to be optimistic for my chances, so I was going to go with her because if her positive attitude meant anything, then I was going to take that chance. So off I went to the neuro rehab ward, which was also a bigger adjustment than I had expected. Got a new physio and a new assistant, which was normal for changing wards. But I was youngest by probably 20 years. And the other patients were fantastic. Everybody was encouraging, but everyone was just in a different life space than I was. And there was lots of structure. You had physio, then you had activities, and everything was half an hour, and these were blocks. And it made my visitors less inclined to visit because they were never sure what was going on, and I couldn't visit if I was in physio. And if they arrived just before physio, then they were paying for parking when they were not seeing me, and my social aspect of it really decreased, which made it a little bit, like I noticed more the miserable aspect of the journey. So I was spending a lot more time staring at a television instead of going outside, because these nurses are here to get you back independent. So they're going to do far less for you. But I wasn't at the stage where I could go out and do my own thing. I needed other people, and nobody was there. So I was stuck within my own head because I couldn't explain myself to anybody and I couldn't go out and get a change of environment to try and stimulate my motivation. But as I became more and more independent, I was given a manual wheelchair and an electric wheelchair. So with the electric wheelchair, I could get myself outside and back inside and around a little bit. And we were able to go to one of my soccer tryouts for the soccer team. And I went to the regatta where I used to work for the summer with the sailing club, which was great to see the community, but it was really hard to watch other people doing exactly what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be on the field, I wanted to be on the water, and I was stuck in a wheelchair when everybody else was running around having a great time. So it got to a bit of a, not a depression, but a lower point. And so I told myself, screw it, I'm not gonna walk, I'm gonna be a wheelchair athlete. That's all right, there's wheelchair athletes, there's basketball and soccer and sports, and I can make this. So hopped myself into my wheelchair, started pushing myself around, made it about a third the way around the unit, and gave up. I was like, this is way too hard, I have to learn how to walk. I can't do this for the rest of my life. So it kind of sparked myself a little bit more to keep going. And I still have huge respect for those athletes because that is a really tough gig. So end of September, beginning of October, I was finally given a date for my discharge, mid to late November, which was later than I had hoped, but earlier than I had actually expected. But this was also when they were trying to get rid of different implements. So get rid of my tilt and space wheelchair because I now had a manual one and I was good by myself. But that tilt and space wheelchair was a huge leaning stone for me because that's what had gotten me to FIFA. That's what had gotten me through ICU. We'd gone through outside together. It was almost a part of me that I was not willing to give up. And if you ask anyone, I made a huge fuss when they tried to get rid of that because it felt like they were just trying to move things along. This is progress, this is good. But to me, they were just taking away the little bits of freedom that I had. And no one seemed to realize the emotional aspect and the safety net thought of what this meant to me. And no one seemed to really care at that point. They were just, I was gonna be gone in a couple weeks and this was the next step. This was how things were gonna go. And as much as I loved being in the manual wheelchair and doing things on my own, I was not exactly ready to be at that state yet. So beginning of October came around and we were getting ready to, I got good at the four-wheeled walker, I got good at working on different little things that I needed to so I could do one step and I could walk on the parallel bar or walk with the parallel bars. So they finally built a ramp at my house, which meant Thanksgiving weekend, I was able to actually go home. So home I went for 2 nights, spent a huge amount of time with friends and family from Duncan. We had a big dinner. I was able to walk in with the walker for our dinner. Was given kind of, my room was moved upstairs. I was independent a little bit. It was weird because home is usually where you're comfortable. It's where you know where things are. But this was a new home for me. I didn't know whether I could fit through the bathroom door with my wheelchair. I didn't know I couldn't have a shower by myself. So these were little things that I didn't realize until I had actually stepped foot in home that they would be an implication to it. This was also the weekend that we were supposed to vote, but I never got to vote because they never told me that we were supposed to vote. And so I was really into throwing fusses at the end of this because I threw a fuss about that too because I was so disappointed that this was the one thing that I was able to do and it was my right and I was not allowed to do it. And I phoned probably 8 different people and showed them my mind that I was going to vote and never got to vote. But it was that little irk that I did not want to be here anymore. I was ready to come home. I was ready to be on my own. So October 28th came. It was a Wednesday, and the Friday before they had told me, I think you can go home this weekend and you probably can't come back. Thinking, okay, they've either given away my room or something is going on that I don't know. And they had organized with the doctors and the physios that I was ready to go home on my own. We tried the ramp, we tried home that one weekend in Thanksgiving, and things were going well. I could do stairs independently. I had moved on from the four-wheeled walker to the forearm crutches, and I was able to get in and out of doors, open up cupboards, and I could make an egg by myself. So packed up all my stuff, walked out with my forearm crutches, with everything else in the wheelchair that my mom pushed behind, dragging the walker behind her. And home we went. And I had organized for outpatient physio beginning in the middle of November because that was my original discharge day. And that was the earliest we could get it. So I went back to the physio that I had before I had even gotten sick, asked him what his situation was, whether he had room for an additional patient. And he said he'd been ready for me since when he first actually heard I was sick. So we'd made a plan. He had these ideas, different thoughts. So we started doing physio 5 days a week and have been doing physio 5 days a week for the last 6 months. And I recently just went down to 2 days a week, but still with the same physio. We're working on balance. We're working on the little things that I never anticipated needing to relearn. So standing on one leg, squatting, getting up off the ground, the little things that make life safer for me, but also make life easier for my mom because she's not worried that I could fall and not get up. So I can get up on my own. I could walk in a straight line. I could walk backwards. I can look over my shoulder while walking or while sitting without feeling ill or feeling dizzy and falling over. And it's been a long process, but it's been a huge eye-opener for the broad spectrum of care that you can get with one diagnosis and with one hospital stay. One thing that I still wonder about is I was optimistic the whole time because nobody told me not to be. I was ready, well, except for Dr. Doom, but I was ready to work hard and get going. But I have no idea how other people dealt with it. I saw my mom a fair bit. She was there nearly every day, so I know her emotional state. But the friends and visitors and my brother and the constant community that was around me, I have no idea how they fared. I don't know what their strategies were, whether they were miserable the whole time, whether they were scared. They could have been optimistic. They could have been anything, and I wouldn't have a clue. No one told me, which was at the time I didn't think about, but thinking about now, it would have been nice if they had shared some of that with me so that I would have been able to then share my thoughts and share, don't be scared, I'm ready to go, or, I can do this, it's not a big deal. To try and give them some of the encouragement that they gave me because it was such a huge help when I was going through it. One of the greatest days that I remember, there's a lot of little things that really made the difference for me. So going outside and 8 North, we spent a day just chatting about life, not about the situation, not that I was sick, but school and what did I want to do when I graduate? Or did I have a boyfriend? Was what I thought of this car, which I'm not a car person, I don't know why that was a topic, but the little things that have absolutely zero relevance to real life, but just make up that human relationship aspect that so many people miss when working in a hospital or when actually being a patient in a hospital, which was kind of amazing because I dealt with so many healthcare professionals, and of the hundreds of people I saw, only 3 of them ever stood out as negative in my experience. There was Dr. Doom, and then a couple of nurses who were, I'm sure, they were good at their job, but they just didn't have the human aspect of being able to relate and be empathetic and compassionate towards other people. So whether or not this is how it actually was, it seemed to me like everybody cared. I never got the impression that I was a burden to anybody. I never got the impression that people didn't want to be there, which was huge when you're working with people who don't want to be there. I didn't want to be there, but the fact that they didn't make me feel like I was a burden to them was a huge weight off my shoulders, as I never had to worry that if I called them, they'd be unwilling to come and help me. And with the coverage with the FIFA game, I met a lot of people who'd been through GBS. So I've met a family whose 3-year-old son had been through it 20 years ago, and he's now 24. He's an athlete, and he's living his life as any normal person would. And there was a gentleman who was 72 when he got it. He's now 75 and a fitness instructor. So they were really positive stories that gave not only my mom somebody to confer in for support, but also gave me something to look towards and be like, you know what, he did it, so why can't I? And I think a benefit of the physiotherapy I received right at the beginning is that when I then started to get better, I was able to do some of the things I wanted to. I didn't have to worry about then getting my range of motion back in my shoulders so that I could reach something above me. It was never completely depleted so that it was then starting from base zero to get back. So when I was able to do that physiotherapy right from the beginning, it gave my mom something able to do as well. So she knew that if the physio wasn't there, she had to move my wrists or my elbows or my shoulders, or she could flex my fingers or do something to keep her hands occupied and her mind occupied, which was a whole different aspect for her because she's used to being in control. She's the nurse. She comes in and, she's the one who helps give the answers and calm the nerves, and this was the completely opposite aspect for her. So I'm going to pass it along to Scott. He has the view from my mom. He's talked to her and has her perspective of the whole journey and what it meant and how she now sees her occupation and sees different patients and their families a little differently.
Thank you, Darbi. So once we were putting this whole presentation together, I just, for 1 minute, took Debbie aside and candidly asked her sort of what some of her thoughts were about this whole transition. When I was working with Darbi, I saw Debbie's strength every day. I was putting Darbi through some terrible, terrible painful treatments, and Debbie was always a level of strength for Darbi. So here's just a couple of quotes that Debbie had from about her time with going through Darbi's whole transition. But in the beginning, she felt like she was chasing a snowball down a cliff. Things just kept on coming and coming. When Debbie was amazed at the amount of involvement she was afforded. So Debbie, as you know, is an RN, and she was allowed to speak in with the rounds in the ICU and was able to help make decisions on Darbi's behalf. And that's not something that's typically done. So there was a lot of family involvement in that regard. She was also impressed with that it was such a long haul and you have to allow your friends to help. This includes rehab, and it's really hard to step back as a parent, especially when your child is having such pain. A few take-homes from this whole presentation that I'd like you to go through. First off, chronic and severe diseases have potential to break the best of us. There are times that I actually had to go off the ward to stairwell just because I was breaking down. I had students that had to leave the room because of what they were experiencing emotionally and spiritually in dealing with some of the stuff we went through with Darbi. Also, some patients are going to beat the odds, not just because of genetics or treatments, but by pure will. Darbi showed that every day. She knew the pain she was going to be dealing with each and every day, but she still pushed. She had a goal she wanted and kept it in mind. And if you can inspire that will in a patient, then they can reach amazing new heights. And that's the thing about physiotherapy, is it's all about potential. With so many different outcomes, if you can inspire your patients to potential, you can actually gain amazing things that others would not expect. So when it comes down to motivation of patients and physios alike, be an example. Choose to move. It's the PABC handle right now, and it is so key. We have to be able to choose to move and be that example for what we want our patients to get to. Inspire progress. Can your patient truly see the changes they're making? Don't show them moment to moment. Show them a broad spectrum. Show where they were a week ago or a month ago. Let them see. Instead of when you're looking at something in a short brief, you can't see the change. But when you can see that large change, it can really be inspiring for them. And be human. Our patients are not numbers, and they don't want to just see numbers. They just don't want to see your goniometer or any dynamometer or anything. They want to work with a human because they are humans. They need that social part, and that can actually be inspiring as well. On behalf of Darbi and I, thank you very much for coming to this presentation. We've had an amazing time, and we'd just like to send you on your best ways and hope you can find that patient that inspires you and that you can aspire to reach new levels that they didn't think was possible.